Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. We're going to give everyone just a second here to get connected. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm Michaela Schmidt. I'm a program coordinator here at the Pulitzer Center. If you haven't joined us before, the Pulitzer Center is a nonprofit journalism and education organization dedicated to raising awareness of underreported global issues. Last year, we supported 275 reporting projects in collaboration with journalists, filmmakers, and news outlets around the globe. We also plan education events and work with classrooms and communities to help extend the impact of that journalism and cultivate public engagement around these issues globally. You can learn a bit more about our work here in our 2022 annual report, which I'm going to share in the chat. Just a few logistics before we begin our conversation. You'll see a Q&A icon on your screen. You can begin adding questions for our panelists at any point throughout our discussion today. You'll also see a chat icon. We would love if you would be willing to share in where you're listening from, and also share any tech issues that you're having using that chat icon. We also wanted to let you know that we are recording this session and it will be posted online following the event. Now, I'm really excited to introduce our panelists for today. First up, we have Blanca Begert, an environmental journalist based in Los Angeles. She previously covered climate news and politics as a fellow with GRIST and was an editor and producer for environmental content at KCET PBS SoCal. She has reported in depth on forest management, environmental justice issues in the US and Latin America. She was Yale's 2020 Reporting Fellow from the Pulitzer Center. Meral Jamal is a journalist based in Nunavut, Canada's vast Arctic territory. Originally from the United Arab Emirates, she is a reporter for Nunatsiaq News in Iqaluit. She writes news and feature stories for Inuit communities across Inuit Nunanat and is a graduate of Carleton University in Ottawa. She's the Pulitzer Center's 2023 Persephone Meal Fellow. Manny Kudluk is an Inuvialuit and was raised in Sax Harbor, Northwest Territories in Canada. Manny has worked in the Arctic as a guide, observer, communicator, and corporate manager. His political career started at age 19 when he was appointed to the Musk Ox Product Company Board of Directors. He has served the community of Sax Harbor as the director of Inuvialuit Game Council, and he was also the director of the Inuvialuit Regional Corporation for 7 years. He's a founding member of Permafrost.net, an initiative for climate change adaptation. We also have Peter Yeung joining us today. He's one of our International Rainforest Journalism Fund grantees and an award-winning freelance journalist who has written for The Guardian, NPR, The Washington Post, National Geographic, the BBC, Wired, and Al Jazeera, among others. He has a background in anthropology and has reported on Indigenous communities in Indonesia, Vietnam, the Democratic Republic of Congo, China, Brazil, and the US. So thank you all so much for joining us today. I'm really excited to be having this discussion with you all. To start off, I would love for each of you just to give us a little bit of an introduction into your background and your reporting projects so we can learn a little bit more about the communities we'll be talking about today. So Peter, would you start us off?
Sure, yeah, thanks, Michaela. And thanks for also navigating that unnecessarily long list of publications I added in there. It's great to be a part of this panel. It's a really interesting topic for me. I think, as you mentioned, yeah, I have a background in social anthropology and I suppose in Indigenous issues, and it's been something that is coming more and more to the fore in my reporting. And so, yeah, basically I sort of have been globally looking at sort of underreported communities across the world, and with climate being a huge story in the involvement and I suppose the role of Indigenous peoples. That's particularly interesting for me. With regards to the most recent Rainforest Journalism Fund project of mine, I was looking at particularly 3 communities in Indonesia where since 2016, basically due to a court ruling, I won't go into too much information on that at this point, but came to recognize what's known as hutan adat, so this customary forest that's sort of run and maintained by indigenous communities over a number of generations. So I visited the Kajang in Sulawesi, who an amazing indigenous people who often, well, pretty much all required to wear sort of locally hand-dyed indigo clothes. They need to walk around barefoot to sort of display a connection with earth. The Ogoni in West Papua, which is sort of the final frontier of Indonesia, where it's got some of the third largest rainforest tract in the world, behind sort of Brazil and the Democratic Republic of Congo, and so that was a whole other aspect in there too, being on the front lines. And also I visited the Wana, another group in Sulawesi, who was sort of very close to some of the huge sort of nickel mine extraction that's going on now, and also the processing of it, and they're quite famous among anthropologists for their sort of shamanic rituals and also sort of sustainable practices when it comes to managing the forest. So that, yeah, that's about it.
Great, thank you. And I know we'll dive into a lot of those details, but Blanca, would you like to go next?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, thanks all for being here, and to Pulitzer for funding my reporting. I used the grant to go to the Peruvian Amazon for a story about indigenous Shipibo communities who were fighting against a regional conservation area that was restricting their livelihoods and their ability to defend their own land. So I'd done reporting on related issues in the Peruvian Amazon of exclusionary conservation and the impacts on local communities. So through connections from that past work, I learned about this case where a 300,000 acre conservation area was imposed over 6 titled Shipibo territories and also 9 hamlets in the area that were populated by local farmers. So for over 10 years now, there have been ongoing fights over this area. A lot of the community members and Shipibo leaders said that the park had been established without a true process of free, prior, and informed consent. And whereas, before the families relied on selling fish from the lake as their primary income, the rules restricted that to only what they could personally use but not sell. And the park received a $3.5 million budget over 5 years, which was supposed to, part of that, go to benefiting the communities, but they never really saw anything from that. And meanwhile, there were major threats in the area that the regional government wasn't really addressing, like cocaine farming invasions and logger invasions, commercial fishing, and then also a fraudulent land titling scheme that had actually given German Mennonites overlapping title over like 2,000 acres of Shipibo titled land. So this dynamic, a very similar one, plays out in protected areas across the Amazon. What was unusual in this case was sort of the response that the communities took here. So about a year ago, a coalition had basically, through a peaceful demonstration, kicked out the park staff and taken over the park offices, and just sort of demanded that the area be turned into an indigenous ecological area, is what they were calling it, that they could manage with the same budget. And that situation is still in limbo. So yeah, my reporting looks into how that park was established and its impact and the options before the communities, and how the fight fits into larger struggles going on globally, which I know we'll be talking about around fortress conservation, which is sort of this Western colonial model that assumes that ecosystems function best in isolation from humans, or severely restricting local people's access to nature, when there's, for years, indigenous people have shown, and studies have backed up, that secure indigenous land rights and control over their territories is a lot more effective than that model in protecting biodiversity. So we'll talk more about that, and I'll cut it off there.
Great, thank you. Meral, would you want to tell us about your project?
Yep, hi. Thank you for the intro, Michaela, and it's nice to see you guys again, Peter, Blanca, and Manny. For my fellowship with the Pulitzer Center, I was looking at what the snow in the Arctic can teach us. And I work in local journalism otherwise. And from the region, we've heard kind of a lot of stories about ice and sea ice and how that's kind of, we're losing Arctic ice, and the impacts and the implications that that will have. But I came across a project by two researchers who were putting together the first snow school in the Arctic and in the world. And the basic premise was, what if we take all the equipment that we have so far used in alpine snow research and put it in the Canadian Arctic instead? And what makes the snow in the Arctic different from snow around the rest of the world? There's a lot of things that do make it different, but that was the research, and I followed the work of the snow school over about a little over a week. And it's also where I met Manny, who will introduce himself, but also, you know, I got to learn a lot about how Inuit have immense knowledge about snow and the surrounding environment, and that there's so much Indigenous knowledge that we can rely on and also learn from when it comes to the Arctic and when it comes to conservation and climate initiatives.
Yeah, thank you. And finally, Manny, would you like to introduce us? Tell us a little bit more about your background.
Thank you, Michaela. My name's Manny Kudluk. I'm Inuvialuit from Sax Harbor, Northwest Territories, the most northwestern community in North America. I've been a part of many projects throughout my career where I've been a small part of the whole system of climate, sort of the broad strokes of getting through to the Southern people and researchers on what exactly we're going through up here, and helping scientists and other Southerners learn and adapt to our lifestyle in the Arctic. And yeah, it was great. I was at the snow school in Cambridge Bay in April, and it's just wonderful to see so much interest in the Arctic. And I always come away from group activities like this are with a great sense that I'm not alone in the Arctic. I may be the furthest away from a lot of people, but there's a big community that cares about our small area. And it's always, like I told them at the meeting, it recharges my batteries when I hear people talk with such interest about the Arctic. And being from the Arctic, I always want to be a part of the conversation. So I've sort of, I wouldn't say forced myself into a lot of conversations, but I've been at the seat of many national and international level groups that work to this problem. So I'm just happy to be here. Really, I don't have any sort of education. I've learned it all as I got thrown in at a young age, and my education was just sitting there and watching our elders sort of teach us younger generation how to fight and how to talk. So yeah, it's a long, I'm an ex-politician, so you have to forgive my long-winded responses, but thank you, Michaela, and I thank the other panelists for coming here today.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. So before we get into some of the more specifics on the history and models of land agreements, I want to first talk a little bit more broadly about the benefit of Indigenous stewardship of land. Kind of like you mentioned, Blanca, I want to ask you all, how do Indigenous communities steward land and cultivate biodiversity in unique and more effective ways than the conservation efforts that money is currently being poured into? And anyone is welcome to jump in and start us off here.
Okay, I guess I'll go ahead since we're following the same order as before. Yeah, I guess this is really the big crux of what we're looking at now, and at least I guess positively, there is, you know, a growing recognition of the role of Indigenous communities. I mean, there's already, and has been actually for a long time, a lot of research sort of showing that, looking at sort of things like deforestation rates and how they are, particularly in cases of where there's sort of secure land tenure, sort of legally recognized land tenure for Indigenous peoples, there is significantly lower deforestation rates. So I think that there's been a number of studies from the likes of the World Resources Institutes, even the Agoni that I visited as well. There was a local NGO did a study of their land, and it was deforestation rate of something like 0.1% over 20 years, compared to something like it was 5 times greater was the sort of national rate. And so yeah, I suppose there's the bare figures, but also when it comes to especially some of this recent reporting that I did, in all of the cases there exists a customary law that sort of dictates the use of these various resources, and it's usually in a way that is sort of promotes sobriety and sort of minimum use. So with the Kajang of Sulawesi, they have this I mean, it's a fascinating group. They believe that their forest that they live in is the most sacred on earth, because that's where the first human in history sort of fell from the sky and landed. And they live by sort of an oral law called the Pasang Ri Kajang, and that really sets out this basically a wider philosophy of, you know, we should only consume what we need at the bare minimum, and even things like the forest, you know, large parts of it can't even be entered under sort of this customary law, and there's strict rules about, you know, what can be used, and in occasions of real need, when trees can be cut down to sort of build the wooden homes that they live in. So yeah, I think there really is, from just the customary law aspect of the way of living, but also more broadly, when we just think about, of course, there is this incentive for Indigenous communities, because you know, this is where they live, and of course they want to maintain it in the long term, and so that's really proven effective by a lot of research and from my reporting on the ground as well.
Yeah, Blanca, do you want to tell us a little bit more about this fortress conservation model that's a very Western ideal that's not always been proven effective?
Yeah, I mean, I can also just kind of quickly following up on what you know, just your prior question too. I mean, I think, you know, there's a big emphasis, like, in this discussion around, you know, Indigenous land stewardship, around Indigenous practices and customs and traditional ecological knowledge, which is real and important. But I think a big way that, like, you know, people that I spoke to through reporting on these issues in the Peruvian Amazon also talk about is just that, you know, like, one big way that Indigenous groups protect biodiversity is that, you know, they are the people who live in the forest and know their land, and what's happening there impacts them, you know, most of all. And in these ways, they're sort of the best position to defend it, at least, you know, in a lot of these communities. And so, you know, the best way to, like, support them doing that is, you know, through secure rights to the places where they live and the resources to support the work that they want to do. And yeah, so I mean, I think to kind of contrast the stuff that Peter was talking about with, you know, the prevailing model of conservation, which is, you know, the protected area model, you know, the prevailing model in terms of how it's promoted by mainstream conservation groups around the world. Like, a lot of that idea, that model really came from you know, originated in and was developed in the United States national park system, and then has been sort of exported around the world. And it rests on this idea that, you know, nature thrives best as separate from humans, when, you know, everything that many of the, like, all the speakers on this call can attest to is that, you know, obviously Indigenous communities have shown for, you know, since the dawn of time that through the right type of you know, approach and knowledge, like, that humans are integral to protecting these ecosystems. So I think like the reporting that I did, if people are curious about this, was part of a larger package that grist.org, which was the outlet that I reported to, put together on fortress conservation and sort of the harms that that model has done to Indigenous communities, and also the cause of conservation over the years, and sort of the pushback that's kind of emerged around that.
And so within the Arctic Snow School model, what Indigenous knowledge, how did that supplement and like help the traditional Western science in the ways that it was lacking with their research, with those lived observations? How were those integrated?
Yeah, so again, like I'm going to rely on Manny a lot to provide perspective. But I think when it comes to like conservation initiatives, and just to give you an example of something that was discussed at the Snow School, one of the researchers who was there talked about how the Peary caribou, which is the smallest North American caribou and has kind of been on the species at risk list for like over a decade, their population is now steadily increasing, and it's actually been downlisted on Canada's species at risk, I guess, list. And it's very interesting because a lot of communities were consulted as part of that, and predominantly 10 Inuit communities were part of a larger project, and they were involved in conservation initiatives, and in many cases kind of limited their own hunting practices or changed their hunting practices to adapt to the changing wildlife population. So I think it's very interesting when it comes to conservation initiatives and biodiversity in the Canadian Arctic, because Inuit communities hold a lot of the knowledge around how the population is changing, but they also have responses to kind of mitigating and helping biodiversity loss either slow down or just kind of for the wildlife population to actually get better over time. Another thing, and it's interesting for, and I'll speak for Nunavut because that's where I'm based, but it's interesting because conservation initiatives that are led by Inuit here help not necessarily solve, but address some of the other systemic issues that exist in the territory and in the community. We know, for example, that Nunavut has 10 times the suicide rate as the rest of Canada, and that conservation initiatives and whether it's guardian programs or on the land programs have not solved that problem, but have helped with a lot of the healing from trauma, both historic and ongoing. The predominant stewardship program or conservation program for one of the regions here in Nunavut, for the Kikitani region, which is the Nautuk program, is very actively including people and hunters and stewards in the community to help fight food insecurity on the ground, which is very important because there's obviously the very high food prices combined with elders and people across generations, Inuit across generations, who may not be able to go out on the land actively, or may not know how to because of the loss of culture and tradition. And that's the final aspect of it, that conservation initiatives that are led by Indigenous communities and Inuit here, they don't necessarily include culture and tradition. They're based on culture and tradition. Like, it's having culture and tradition at the center of the conversation versus, using it as something to guide the larger work. And yeah, I think I'll Manny, if you'd like to add more to that. And yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Meral, for bringing up the Peary caribou. That's one feather in our cap that we're just proud of, and I wish more people knew that from start to finish, getting these caribou off the list have been the invaluable behind every step of the way, and we guide and sometimes even craft policy that has federal weight and power because of our land claim, which is the Inuvialuit Final Agreement, which was signed in 1984. So we're looking at our 40th year anniversary next year, which is another feather in the cap, I guess, for Canada, because that was one of the first land claims that was signed in our country, and it gave the Inuvialuit economic and environmental powers that we use to try and become a part of Canada as one of our main goals. Our three main goals is to adapt and change to what's happening in society and not stay a static cultural communities. We're no longer untouched by technology, so we have all the advances that you have down south, and we've been making good use of them since 1984. And before that, the COPE, who originally negotiated our land claim, and the land claim itself gives us a whole group, we call them the alphabet companies. There's so many to name there. They even have a little glossary because we have so much regulatory bodies and federal bodies that we're partnered with, we're co-managing with. We're not coming to them with a hat in hand trying to beg them to change this or help this. We are partners in the way we develop policy. So yeah, we're the first ones through the door, which is not always great. A lot of our policies are very short and very concise, or not concise, but very short and able to interpret in many ways, which was good for us, so we could move forward how we chose to, not how a lawyer defined our laws. So we've been doing this for a long time, and we have funds as well where we, if we want research to happen, we can approve and we can use our own money to do what we need to do. So it's not perfect, like we have problems, but the rule book we're given really helped us move forward. Like one of the first things that I got shown the world of climate change was when the International Institute of Sustainable Development used Sachs Harbor to showcase climate change for the first time, and like it was great, like the spot, and that's where I got hooked. And meeting people like you guys has always been just a joy, and I love to talk. I love when people love to hear me talk. So I'm one of those people that I just sort of blast information. I don't necessarily give you specifics, but I'll give you as much information as I can to help you do what you need to do up here. And again, I'm sorry, I'm very long-winded.
No, not at all. And just to follow up on that a little bit more, Manny, in one of our previous conversations, you mentioned how this land claim agreement even gave you ability to help with the oil companies that were in the area and some regulations. And you'd also mentioned the funding and research and how you found that there was, in some ways, even more business in that research aspect. But could you just tell us a little bit more about some of those details?
Sure, yeah, like one of the reasons our land claim was started was because oil companies were coming up here making seismic lines, cutting through hunters and sub-trappers lines. So that was when COPE was born, and Committee for Original Peoples Entitlement. COPE was the one that negotiated our land claim in the beginning, and from there, we developed our relationship with the oil companies, where they kind of know if they're coming up to the Arctic, they're facing some of the best regulators on the planet. And that's one of the things that kind of saddened me about our government's decision to the moratorium on the Arctic was just, it was sort of a slap on to evaluate our collective faces, saying that we didn't know how to regulate our part of the world or how to safely do this. So I have a big chip on my shoulder for that, and I don't want to bring it too much to bear, but it's just one of the things where we've developed to a point where we're not as unskilled or uneducated as many people down south think. We're eager and we're willing to develop resources, but they have to be along our traditional beliefs and guidelines. We have an important thing called traditional knowledge in our region where it's looked at with equal weight to science now. So we use our elders' experiences to temper scientific research in the Arctic now. So we've come a long way, and we have a clause in our agreement that's sort of a us too clause, where if one native group who signs a land claim gets more than us, we're technically supposed to be able to get that as well in our land claim, but it's never actually worked. Since we were the first land claim, everyone builds their template off ours, so it's easy to see where they filled their gaps that we sort of missed, which is inevitable. It's just you can't write a perfect document. But we have been in the process as well of trying to start a marine protected area for a number of years, and it got held up by our leadership because there was no seat at the table from the government for them. So I think they just got that now. So we'll probably be in the process of creating a protected area around Banks Island, which is the 24th largest island on the planet. So, and we're the only community on the island. So it's a big responsibility to look after. And as soon as we signed our land claim as well, we immediately created a national park, which is the Olivik National Park, which is the most northerly navigable river on the planet. So if you want to come check that out, we've protected area, our region. But I might have missed your question too, just talking myself.
No, that was all wonderful. So like you said, the Arctic has one of the oldest land agreements. So Blanca, in contrast, your reporting focused on a community that was fighting to reclaim their lands. So can you, and that's a common struggle for many Indigenous communities, especially in the Amazon region. So can you tell us a little bit more about the lack of autonomy and the lack of transparency and funding and some of the other concerns that the Shipibo people had?
Yeah, so I mean, across the Amazon, there's thousands of Indigenous communities that don't have land title. And, you know, Amazonian Indigenous people have been really like central to the push to make rights-based approaches central to the conservation conversation globally. So, you know, for example, demanding that like REDD+ carbon offset projects don't go forward on Indigenous lands unless communities have been formally titled. So obviously that's like really critical and has been a central priority for Indigenous groups. But I mean, I'll say with the story that I was reporting on with the Pulitzer grant, and I mean, that story and a lot of other research has shown that just having land title is not enough necessarily to protect communities from these sort of exclusionary fortress conservation models. So in this case, the communities where I was, they received their title back in the 70s, but that didn't stop this area from being imposed on top of the territory, which in Peru is technically legal. You know, communities are supposed to be able to agree to like be part of a conservation area in exchange for certain benefits, but a lot of time, and you know, this is what was being argued there, that the process is done in a kind of the community consultation and input process is done in a really perfunctory way that doesn't actually inform the whole community or get true buy-in. So that was part of the issue there, that communities, even if they have title, can still be sort of, not fully participate in decisions made about the land at the government level. And then, many people I talked to said time and again, they don't oppose conservation. They wanted control over how it was done. So in that area, in addition to the restrictions that were placed on their livelihoods without their consent, this was a really poor area, and they knew that all this money was coming in, supposed to go towards, supporting their development. And, they really had no idea where that money was going. And so they were looking for mechanisms in the law, like where they could actually, not just like they had their land title, but actually where they could get control over the money that would come in specifically for conservation. So, they were looking at like communal reserve options, private conservation areas. And, it was difficult because the law isn't really set up to support that so much. And it's kind of remained to be seen if the national government would, decide in their favor, or if the courts would, if they were going to take it to the courts.
Yeah, and we've found that this is a common trend, that the money allocated towards Indigenous communities and climate change isn't necessarily getting to them. In COP26 in 2021, world leaders pledged to provide $1.7 billion to support Indigenous communities working to reduce deforestation. But the Forest 10-Year Funders Group in their one-year report found that only 7% of the funding actually reached Indigenous people and local communities. So Peter, in our previous conversation, you had mentioned a bit of a direct funding model that they were experimenting with in Indonesia. Could you tell us a little bit more about that, as we're trying to figure out effective ways for the money to actually reach the communities it's pledged to support?
Yeah, of course, yeah, it's a great point, and I guess it's the big challenge really, because wherever there is, a significant amount of money, it's there's often going to be a lot of funneling of that and going to if not corruption, then just to middlemen along the way, and as well, like, I think also when we're looking at beyond, I think you pointed out some of the 7% of only funding has sort of come through from that COP26, that 1.7 billion from COP26 so far in the first year. I mean, I imagine normally it would, will take a bit longer to funnel through, but it is still concerning how little it's been. But yes, and actually, basically, this new model, I think it was maybe 3 months ago, was sort of launched in Indonesia, called the Nusantara Fund, and that is actually connected to this COP26 funding. But basically, it's looking at it's up to sort of $20 million. Where the idea is actually sort of a direct funding mechanism by which there's actually three sort of Indonesian NGOs that have been chosen to sort of help manage these funds. So there's AMAN, which is basically the leading sort of indigenous peoples organization in Indonesia, the KPA, which is to do with agrarian conflict, and WALI, which is the country's sort of largest green group. And basically representatives from those nonprofits will also serve on a board with representatives from across Indonesia's indigenous communities in order to sort of decide how that funding will be dispersed. But essentially, there's this idea of independent nonprofits in sort of tandem with representatives from those communities deciding on projects that are sort of directly decided with the input of Indigenous there, and that shows a lot of promise. It's still very much only in the early stages, having only been announced a few months ago, and this is actually, I think it's over, this is over the next decade as well, so it's really going to take quite a few years to sort of really see the benefits from it, but it does seem like a pretty promising model, and there's going to be a lot of interest to see how that does turn out.
Yeah, so I want to move to a question I see from an audience member here in the chat that I think will be a little challenging, but do any of you have a model nation in mind for some of its policies with Indigenous groups, and how that government is navigating the social and environmental needs of its communities? The answer could be no.
Well,
I
I
want
guess,
to
sorry.
sorry.
Well, thank you, Meryl. Well, again, our Inuvialuit final agreement is probably a good template. It's one of the shortest land claim agreements out in Canada, so it's not a hard read. It's fairly straightforward. We're pragmatic, and I always thought it was one of the best documents out there because it basically gave my people our power source, our power base, our right to govern. So yeah, I'm biased in saying that our best document is the Inuvialuit final agreement, and hopefully it could change and adapt to meet the new world.
Yeah, and I'm gonna jump in and just say, like, I think one of the struggles is just like seeing the Arctic as homogenous, which it's not. I mean, and in many cases, especially since like the invasion of Ukraine last year, the geopolitics has shifted so much that there are people who argue that it's important to identify that there's 3 Arctics now. Like there's the North American Arctic, the European Arctic, and then the Russian Arctic. And I will say that the Canadian Arctic is doing, like, it has its land claim agreements in place, which is a good first step. I mean, we know, for example, in Norway, Finland, and Sweden with the Sami, there's no agreement in place, and that really impacts just the conservation policies and just everything to do with the Sami and their culture and their way of life. I don't have enough information about, for example, Alaska or the Russian Arctic, but as far as I know, Canada does have land claim agreements in place that really clearly set out just how the land is used, how the land is conserved, and also how Inuit and other Indigenous communities should be involved. That being said, I also think the question about if there is a model nation should maybe be changed to if there is a model community, because model Indigenous community, because in that regard, I will say that the land claims agreement was fought for by Inuit and Inuvialuit, you know. It was very much kind of spearheaded from the communities themselves, and I think that it really shows that when an Indigenous community kind of really pushes for something, so much as possible, and it very much, like, I'm not sure if Canada is a model in agreeing or accepting a lot of Indigenous people, communities, and their rights, but I will say that the Inuit have been at the forefront of kind of fighting the government and actually making sure that they have a right to their lands and a right to their environment.
And yeah, just to add to, oh, sorry.
Sorry, Peter. Yeah, just one more point. I see the question in the comments there about tourism, and we found in West research is an offshot tourism, like having research projects and having scientists come up and sort of look at what you want them to look at, is very similar to tourism. You're bringing out someone who doesn't have a clue where they're going. They're there for the experience. It's the parallels of research and tourism are really close. So tourism's okay, like, but research is where the real money is, because they come out with more questions that need to be answered. So they bring up more people with more toys, and they pay for private charters and all that. So it's just for the question on having sustainable tourism. I think tourism is just a part of the bigger picture.
Yeah, I just wanted to add quickly on that, the point with regards to whether it's a model nation in terms of policies. It's a great question, Gary. And I suppose it is if only that did exist. Unfortunately, at least to my knowledge, there are a lot of flaws in each system. As Manny and Meral were explaining, obviously what's been done in Canada with the sort of land agreement, that is actually really interesting. In Australia, I know that sort of something like 20% of the land is legally owned by Indigenous peoples under sort of the sort of the law, the policy that was introduced there. So that's quite a significant amount. I also know in Colombia, I believe they have their own sort of government ministry that's sort of dedicated to Indigenous peoples. But even so, each policy has a lot of flaws, even in terms of what's being done in Indonesia. There's a few issues that, like, one, for example, is that in order for this land recognition to be given, first of all, it has to be recognized at the regional level, which can, given the sort of regional politicians might have their own sort of vested interests, and generally it requires the support of non-profits to help these. Well, I mean, it's basically obligatory, because otherwise these Indigenous groups wouldn't be able to sort of navigate the required bureaucracy in order to do it anyway. But beyond that, yes, I think really there's bits to learn from everyone. What Indonesia is doing has proven quite successful, and they are scaling it up. But as far as a model nation, I think we're quite far from that still.
And so, to Manny's point about tourism and this question in the chat, I did want to ask you, Peter, since it was specifically intended for you, do you have thoughts on that as well?
Oh, yes. Okay. And in terms of tourism, it's an interesting one. And I think some of the reporting that I did does already have quite a bit of overlap of some of the ideas that they are exploring. The Gajang, which I visited, they are one of the better known Indigenous groups in Indonesia, and so they have over the years had. I mean, they were among the first group of 9 Indigenous groups that were recognized in 2016, and they have had visitors sort of come over time, and I suppose it is looking at sort of the long-term sustainability of these programs and helping. Obviously, in these Indigenous groups, there's generally quite a high poverty rates, and it can be difficult, particularly in a sort of a modernizing world. I suppose the issue in some cases is that with the development of tourist infrastructure, and that's something that the Ogoni, who I visited, are looking at, that also requires development of road building and construction of amenities, and with that also obviously necessarily the cutting down of trees, and I suppose impacting the way that these communities live. And so that is it's quite a difficult tightrope to walk, because obviously there's the desire of certain communities to want to sort of improve their living conditions, but at the same time, I suppose tourism could be an answer if done properly. Others might look at the Ogoni also were looking at sort of developing and producing sort of sustainable goods that are from the local area. So there's the buah merah, the red fruit, which is high in antioxidants and supposed to be made into an oil, and it is considered something of a miracle fruit across Indonesia, and so that's another approach, I suppose, into sort of bringing income in the area without necessarily having that required infrastructure development at the same time.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I'll just add one quick thing on the tourism front, which is something that I've seen a lot of in Peru in the reporting I've done, that I think a big question around it, which everyone kind of pointed at, is like, who gets the true benefits of tourism, and who really has control again of how the projects are implemented. And I think if for people who are interested in this question, I think I've seen projects that are put in place in protected areas, because tourism is like a ecotourism is sort of one of the income streams that's often paired with protected area models as a way to kind of compensate communities for the restrictions on their livelihoods, and then it doesn't necessarily bring the income that's sort of expected from it. But there is one case that I haven't reported on, but I'm familiar with the Guna communities in Panama who have, through a lot of political struggle, gained like full control over the tourism, like permitting and income streams from the San Blas Islands, and I think a couple other like tourist destinations in Panama. And it's been for them like an ongoing political fight with the government there, trying to reach back in and gain access to that income. So I think it's a really interesting area, and again, like just something that a lot of it depends on where like decision-making control and where the money actually goes.
Yeah, definitely. Well, as we're nearing our time, I know we could talk so much more about all of this. I thought this question would be a great note to kind of wrap up on here. As, and I'll add, non-Indigenous journalists covering stories on Indigenous communities, how are you ensuring that your reporting highlights the community members' agencies and not contributing to the exoticization of Indigenous communities while still talking about the struggles and the problems that they're facing?
Should I go? I can go. I think the biggest thing for me, and it's been a challenge kind of being in local journalism, but also pursuing long-term climate-related journalism projects within Inuit communities. It's just being open to having the story change. And I think that that's one way to ensure that Inuit or the Indigenous people involved have agency within the story, but they're also that the story is led by them and led by their knowledge and strengthened by it. Even in the Snow School, for example, my initial pitch involved just the focus on the school itself and the fact that there were like 40 researchers from across the world that were coming together. But then it was spending time with Manny and Margaret and Jim and all the Inuit knowledge keepers and knowledge holders at the school that kind of changed the story in the end, and changed the way, like it changed the questions that I was asking. And a lot of times Manny and the others kind of had information about the surrounding environment that even the researchers didn't have. You have these researchers come in and they're like, we want to learn about Arctic snow. And we've been researching this for 20 years. But then Margaret, who was one of the elders, pointed out that the big difference is that the snow sounds different based on where you are kind of standing. And that was an example of where one of the leads in the school just said that I had never thought about this. And that became kind of a central point of tension in my story, that you have these researchers come in, but the knowledge exists and it's lived on among Inuit. It's just a matter of asking questions. So I'm not sure if that directly addresses the question of how do you ensure that Inuit and Indigenous people have agency, but it's very much going in with maybe a plan or an idea, but being open to having the story change, and to having it change based on what the people in the community tell you, and trying to get that out versus maybe your version based on your initial research. So
I agree, Meral. Also that networks play an extremely important role in this. We are fairly remote, so our chance at meeting new people is very limited, and the only way you could teach someone about the Arctic is to meet with them face to face, so they hear the inflections in your voice and see the emotion in your eyes. So I really believe that stuff like this, networking with people who are just as interested about the changing environment as we are, in adaptation and research especially, that I'll say yes to anything that something comes along. I'll happily make a fool of myself to talk about it, or if not make a fool of myself, at least be heard or hear what others have to say. So I think that's the most important thing for getting Indigenous, or our involvement is that we just need to meet with you. We just need a chance and an opportunity to talk with you, because most people understand. It's just they have little questions and they really want to see the humanity of it all and not just number crunching being thrown at you. So yeah, come visit the Arctic, come tourism is not just looking at stuff, it's coming to understand the culture. And I just believe that the more meetings we have like this face to face, that we're solving the problem one little increment at a time, instead of trying to do these big super projects that always lead to like corruption, or not corruption, but just waste of money, waste of time, waste of effort. But if we talk to a person and they feel like they understand after they leave the conversation, that's the biggest help we could do for the Indigenous, or for us. And I don't want a third person myself, I keep doing that, but it's, yeah, as long as we get to meet with you guys and you guys are truly interested and you're not here just to push an agenda, we're just as happy as to meet with you as you are to meet with us.
Yeah, I suppose I'll echo both what Meral and Manny were saying. I suppose before we were also talking about just more broadly sort of how to properly accurately represent Indigenous peoples and their way of living as sort of non-Indigenous journalists. And I think, yeah, it's a great point from Meral before in terms of just allowing the well, there not to be sort of a preconceived narrative when going into the reporting. I think is also often really helpful to do as much pre-research as possible, working with NGOs and the like. I remember that I did some reporting actually before in Navajo Nation, and just when it came to interacting with some of the elders, I remember there was one elder that I interviewed, and we were on a fairly tight schedule, so but I still had a decent amount of time to do the interview. But when I began asking just my very first question, the elder sort of responded and began addressing part of my question, but then started recounting sort of a lot of more sort of broader sort of knowledge about the Navajo in general. And he kept on going, and I was trying to interrupt, but I sort of resisted, because as explained to me by the NGO, was that as I found out that actually Navajo elders prefer to actually take you through sort of almost the history of their lives, or very in detail in terms of the their answers before they'll properly go into specifics as well. So yeah, just highlighting the value of working with those, you know, Indigenous beforehand, or nonprofits that are working with them, and also just in terms of centering the voices of the people that you're reporting on. Is obviously really great for the Pulitzer giving this kind of funding to actually go on the ground. I know that the Ogoni and the Wana, I think I was the first sort of international reporter to visit either of those groups, and really being able to sort of show that nuance of their experience. So speaking not only to sort of the traditional power brokers, but also young people and women. So in the case of the Ogoni as well, Justina Ogoni, who she had a really amazing story of how she'd faced a lot of actual sexism, even through the traditional Indigenous structures, but she'd gone on to sort of become the head of the district too. And basically, yeah, I tried to shape my stories around those characters, but showing that, you know, they are not all sort of one group that can be easily generalized, and one that has sort of a lot of nuance within it.
I'll just add quickly, because I know we're at time, but I think this is a really important question, and to the aspect around avoiding the exoticization in reporting. I think there's been a lot of Indigenous scholarship that's been really critical about how science and mainstream conservation and just the broader discourse and probably journalism as well has focused a lot on sort of the practices and knowledge of Indigenous people at the expense of struggles for sovereignty and political power, and so without those things, which without which traditional ecological knowledge and all of that is really a lot less useful, without, again, like land control and these things we've been talking about. So I, to that end, do kind of look for places and stories where there's like a political struggle, and try to kind of amplify or dig into that. And then again, to what everyone else was saying, I think that's also important about going in with humility and openness to new framings of what the stories can be based on what you hear from the ground. Spending time, not going in to the best, to the degree that it's possible, really trying to like reduce the sense of urgency and the sense of having your own agenda and listening for what comes up, and also being really transparent with people you talk to about why you're there and how you're reading the situation, to kind of get feedback from them as you go through the process of reporting.
Yeah, thank you all so much. I would love to keep talking, but I also do want to respect everyone's time today. So we appreciate all of you in our audience for joining us. And for those of you who are able, we'd love for you to consider becoming a Pulitzer Center champion to support our work. Finally, a brief survey will follow the end of this webinar. We'd really appreciate you taking just a minute or two to give us a little feedback and help us better understand how we can improve our events. So again, thank you so much to all of our panelists, and thank you to all of you for joining us today. We'll post the recording of this after on our website in case any of you want to share it out or rewatch to hear from some of the amazing things all of these people had to say. Hope you all have a great rest of your day. Bye, everyone.
So